we've all got our war stories. In the cross-border space, we've all got our war stories. Right, okay, so let's start this from the beginning. Indians in America, what are what are the most common Indian financial assets, tools, accounts that you see cropping up, and how should they be treated?
There are ways that in India, let's say, for example, going back to this country, there is a way that you can classify certain things. You can never, there are other people that you have spoke to and they've already talked about this. It's really not, you can't go and put things in a trust, just because you're leaving that country, because that, again, triggers a whole lot of other situations which we don't want.
Welcome to Expat Wealth, a Plan First Wealth podcast dedicated to helping ambitious expatriates in America and Americans overseas thrive. I'm your host, Richard Taylor, and Plan First Wealth is the business I founded and run today, and we work with successful expatriates, immigrants, and internationally minded Americans to make the most of their opportunity and avoid the expat landmines. First, a quick disclaimer. While Plan First Wealth LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor, the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of Plan First Wealth. Information presented is for educational purposes only. Now, if you aren't already receiving our emails, please go to our website, www.planfirstwealth.com, and sign up there. It's free, and you'll be notified every time we drop a new episode, and so much more. Okay, let's get back to this week's show.
Welcome to an Ask an Expert show from Expat Wealth. My guest today is Manasa Nadig. Manasa is the owner and CEO of MN Tax and Business Services, and she is also the co-host with our friend Jane Meafham of the International Money Cafe podcast. And she is joining us today to discuss what Indian expats in America and those thinking of coming to America need to be aware of from a tax and financial perspective. Hi, Manasa. Welcome to Expat Wealth.
Hi, Richard.
Okay, so if you wouldn't mind, would you just introduce yourself for the folks listening?
Absolutely. So I'm an enrolled agent, which means my license to practice is from the Internal Revenue Service, for those who don't know. And I have the same rights to represent my clients with the Internal Revenue Service and all of that good stuff. I live in the Southeast Michigan area, and I have been practicing for a long time now. Although I've been on my own, say maybe about around 13 or 14 years. So during this time, do a lot of cross-border tax compliance and foreign assets reporting and all of that, because we have found that there aren't as many people that there should be who can help out in this area. That's a little bit about me, and we can get started with whatever questions you have for me.
Yeah, well, this is a bit of an unusual one for me, actually, because historically we've stuck mostly to British expat stuff, which is very much my wheelhouse. But having decided to expand the scope of the podcast, you are our first guest who is explicitly going to be talking about another expat group. So I'm actually going to be leaning quite heavily on you this time. Now, the reason I decided to expand the scope was because I want, so much of the cross-border stuff is transferable. The 80-20 rule, 80% is applicable to all expats. And it's just more interesting, I think, as well, to learn about all these different perspectives. So whilst I think I'm on relatively safe ground, because I think I do know my stuff in the cross-border world, the 20% that is very specific to Indians in America or Indians thinking about coming to America, I'm going to be leaning on you very heavily. So that's what we're going to talk about today is how should Indians who are already in America or thinking about coming to America, what do they need to be thinking of? What do they need to be aware of? What are the traps that exist? And how can we help them avoid those traps? How can we help set them up for success here?
Absolutely. Definitely. For any expat coming to the US, there's a whole list of things that needs to be done. And as far as, Brits and everybody else, actually, a lot of these rules apply to no matter which country you're coming from. But when you get to a certain specific country, there are all of these terminology and maybe similar kind of assets, but with different names, and those are subject to U.S. tax reporting. And funny story, of course, is, we have so many clients, and they necessarily may not have had only a footprint in India, right? They could have traveled to different countries, and then they must have come to the U.S. as well. For example, the last time you and I spoke, I was telling you the story about one of my clients who went from India to Australia, worked there for a few years, accumulated some retirement accounts and bank accounts, and then moved from there to the UK, accumulated some other pensions in the UK and stuff like that, and then came to the US. And during this time, they did also build their wealth in India. So now they had a footprint across like 4 countries. But staying specific to kind of India today, there are many,
Manasa, when they first approach you, so this is an Indian with Indian stuff, with Australian stuff, with British stuff, with American stuff. When they first approach you, what was their affairs like? Were they in well order, or from a US perspective, were they a bit of a disaster?
Surprisingly, because they were one of those high net worth individuals who had been helped by one of the big 4 companies, until the time that they approached me. Their foreign reporting, so to speak, especially because they had their footprint in so many different countries, were relatively in good order. Now, there were some specifics that had kind of been missed, but I think that I take that as a win, actually, especially when you are looking at that kind of an extent of holding and there's so many different countries involved. So unfortunately, this particular person did not have a horror story to go with their reporting. But there have been horror stories from other people, which, I don't know if we'll have time to go into that today, but definitely, yeah, all kinds of, non-reporting, non-compliance and everything, which we've helped clean up, but not in this particular
case. We've all
got
our war stories. In the cross-border space, Absolutely. We've all got our war stories. Right, okay, so let's start this from the beginning. So Indians in America, what are the most common Indian financial assets, tools, accounts that you see cropping up, and how should they be treated?
So, of course, there are the bank accounts. That's the no-brainer. Now, when there is a US person and they go and open a bank account in India, and India and the US have the FATCA agreement, the intergovernmental agreement. So like we always talk about FATCA, when you go and you are not a person of that country, the bank asks you, if you are a US person, and then everything gets reported under FATCA. So if you are such a person, then you would have opened a non-resident account in India, because you're not allowed to open an ordinary bank account. They already tag that with a non-resident ordinary or a non-resident external account. Now, you may have opened an account when you lived in India and it was an ordinary bank account, but the rules under the Reserve Bank of India say if you've been outside India for a while, then there is a period of time after which these ordinary accounts get converted to a non-resident account. So any bank account, even if you have not made that change, even if they continue to be ordinary bank accounts, they need to be reported, of course. There are now mutual funds, etc., are called differently. They are kind of the way that we have the ETFs and the brokerage accounts. In India, they're called DEMAT accounts.
They're called what? DEMAT?
DEMAT, yeah, DEMAT. It's a short form for, I think it says it's short for dematerialization or something like that, but that's what it is. These are DEMAT accounts. And usually DEMAT accounts hold mutual funds, other ETFs, sometimes life insurance policies, and sometimes DEMAT accounts could also hold savings accounts within that wrapper. So these are DEMAT accounts, and we'll come back to that later.
So broadly, that's what we would call a brokerage here, or in the UK, a GIA, broadly.
Yeah, broadly, yes. Yeah. And then, of course, there are the retirement accounts. There are the employer provident funds, which, the employer contributes into and the employee contributes into. Then there are the public provident funds, which are the PPFs and the EPFs earlier. Now, the public provident funds are like individual retirement accounts here in the US. There is no employer, and you can contribute into the public provident fund on your own, and that does lower your taxes on your Indian tax account. A return if you have to file. So definitely both of those. And then insurance policies. Now, insurance policies in India are very popular. And there are many insurance policies that are wrapped like a retirement policy. And, these are people pay premium into these policies and then they leave them alone. And then there is a balloon payment after a certain amount of time. So these insurance policies are where we get into the whole gray area of PFIC reporting, but I'll come to that later. So the big broad ones here are bank accounts, retirement accounts like the Provident funds, the insurance policies like that we already talked about, and the DEMAT accounts, So these are the four broad category of financial accounts that most Indians, or they're popular among expats in India and the US residents who have Indian bank accounts. Yeah, financially.
Imagine an Indian moves here mid-career. They're going to have bank accounts. They're going to have a DEMAT account. They're probably going to have at least an employer Provident account, maybe also a public Provident account. And maybe, quite possibly if they're that popular, they're going to have some of this life assurance, cash value, investment value insurance as well going on. All of which can cause major headaches in America. So should we go through one by one? So let's start with the most obvious one, the bank accounts. What does that require?
Well, bank accounts are actually simplest of all of these, right? Because you have statements available from them, you have the interest rates, and then you have the exchange rate. And, basically everything comes together pretty simple. You can get a statement from the bank, which corresponds to the calendar year, whereas, the Indian tax year, like the UK and Australia and some other countries, are at a different cadence. They do not correspond to the calendar year, but statements are available. So to parse through the information that you need to, a report on a person's US tax return is pretty straightforward. So there's the bank account. And the bank account, of course, there are the fixed deposits, the recurring deposits, and all sorts of certificates of deposits that are there within that. So that's pretty straightforward. The next one is the employer provident fund. That one and the public provident fund. The public provident fund is where people kind of get into this gray area. Some people think and treat it as if it is Social Security. Now, there is no guidance, of course, from the Internal Revenue Service that says public provident fund is equivalent to Indian Social Security, which if you really just look at the language of what Social Security benefits are, and you look at the public provident fund, there is some overlap, but it's not black and white. You can't say that this is Social Security because somebody who is high net worth can still opt to contribute into a public provident fund, or I'll call it PPF.
But yeah, when you were explaining it, it sounded more like an IRA.
Exactly. It sounded like an IRA, and I think that it is an IRA. It's not a Social Security account because you have access to the funds and you can see the money, you can see the growth and all of that. Basically, you go to any bank and you can open a PPF over there. That's a common...
Yeah, that doesn't sound like Social Security to me. Is there a Social Security equivalent in India? Like we have the basic state pension in the UK, Social Security in America. Is there an Indian equivalent?
Not really.
Oh, really?
Not really.
Wow.
Yeah. There is no Social Security there. There are all sorts of welfare schemes, but those are targeted to the not so fortunate strata of society, people who may not necessarily be in the US, right? So there is nothing that would just equal US Social Security or national insurance in the UK. People like to think that the PPF is one, but I think that, that is not a correct assumption. I would treat it as a retirement account.
It certainly sounds like a retirement account from what you've explained to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There is the EPF, of course. Now, the EPF is where it gets tricky, and it is dependent on where the person is. Now, suppose if this is a US citizen expat who is living in India and working in India and contributing into the EPF, actively right now, they're actively employed, it could be treated as a defined benefit or a defined contribution plan, right? Because it seems like it's the similar sort of a wrapper. But if this is a person who used to work in India and has now come to the US and is no longer actively contributing into it, they can still keep the EPF active, so to speak. They don't have to, close it out or take money out. But it is a reportable asset on your FATCA or FBAR, all of that. So that is a regular retirement account.
Manasa, is there also, is there more reporting? We've got FBAR, obviously, but is there also 8930A? Is there a 3520 for any of these?
The 3520s and the 3520As is, again, where we get into the gray with the guidance. Now, are these foreign grantor trusts, and can they be classified as foreign grantor trust, or are they exclusively not categorized as such under the RevProc 2020-17? We don't have clear guidance on that. So right now, what most tax practitioners do is they do not treat this as a foreign grantor trust. It's like any other defined benefit, defined contribution plan, which, is reportable on your FATCA and FBAR, of course, if thresholds are crossed in aggregate, but it does not get any other special reporting like the 8621s or the 3520s.
Okay. Oh, good to know. Okay, so no 3520 and no 3520A, we think. That's nice. That's nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, I'll take that win.
Yeah. And of course, then there is the DEMAT account, which holds the mutual funds.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever we say mutual funds, we all get into that fun, which I'm saying fun in a very sarcastic way, the PFIC regime. And that's where it gets really tricky because, again, here, the DEMAT is a very popular holding, right? Because if you are living in India, this is one of your investment vehicles. You want to contribute into it. You want to see the money grow. You want to see the wealth grow. But then there are PFIC reporting rules to that. And, we do have the mark to market. Most of them, we have to do the mark to market because they are not eligible for the QEF election. Mm-hmm. And when you do the mark to market, yes, the unrealized capital gains, etc., they are subject to ordinary income tax rates.
So let's just bring everyone up to speed on this. So I have done dedicated episodes on PFICs before. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but if people go and look back for an episode with Brian Dunhill, we cover the demon that is PFICs. Non-US collective investments, mutual funds, ETFs, are generally considered PFIC. Stands for passive foreign investment companies, not that matters, but they are, in general, the rule is for US taxpayers to avoid them like the plague in general. This is because they come with additional reporting requirements, onerous reporting requirements on each individual PFIC, each individual investment. So if you have a DEMAT account with 10 ETFs, 10 mutual funds in there, that's 10 individual forms. And these are not simple forms, folks. And then on top of that, the general rule is there's pretty onerous taxation, or punitive taxation. There are elections available, to your point, right? But am I right in thinking even if you can get the mark to Model 1, you have to do that. If you have to do that up front, and if you miss it, it's gone. So, and correct me if I'm wrong here, if your experience is like mine, everyone moves to America, no one knows about this. People don't report their pensions on the forms we're talking about. People don't report the PFICs. They miss the opportunity to elect. And we're into a whole... Now we have non-compliance and high taxation and very little we can do about it.
Exactly. And, when it comes to India, what happens is sometimes if the holdings are pretty substantive, even with the not so great exchange rate, like last time I checked, it was 90 rupees to a US dollar. But even with that, the taxation aspect of these PFICs can be, like you said, punitive. So you cannot just tell somebody, oh, you got to get rid of this. They may be in their and may have lived, 3/4 of their working life in India, and they have these huge mutual funds. So you just have to then look at what their big picture plan is from a financial planning perspective, a cross-border financial planning perspective. Are they going to live in the US long term, and what do they want to do with all of these PFICs? And since we're talking about PFICs, actually, let me quickly insert here while we mentioned life insurance policies earlier. There is a particular life insurance policy in India called the ULIP. Now, the ULIP, what happens is a lot of the ULIPs are the back end are invested in the market. So these could also be subject to PFIC. These are not opaque insurance policies. So then you get into all of this PFIC reporting. And so you hear, now take a 40-year-old person who has been working since their 20s, this 20 years of accumulated wealth, insurance policies, DEMATS, etc., and they come to the US on an L1 visa. Now, they come to you and they have all of this, there's PFIC reporting. And even if you start it from day one, just the mark-to-market election is, you're looking at this and you're going, wait a minute, and that's when it gets into, is it worth keeping this or selling them off? Because selling them off may not be an option. Maybe this person is here for just 3 years and they want to go back.
Ultimately, within a DMAT, if it's just a regular ETF mutual fund, it's an easy process to sell if it's determined. Am I right in thinking, though, insurance can be much harder to unwind? Much, much harder to unwind. It might not even, without abandoning the whole policy, which can have an enormous cost.
Exactly.
I imagine. I'm unfamiliar with the specific plans, but I'm familiar with the type in general, just not an option.
So you got to factor that in. And so I've had a lot of these conversations with financial planners in India where we take into account the projected growth in all of these accounts, whether they're DEMATs or ULIPs or insurance policies, whatever you have which may be subject to PFIC treatment. We look at the extent of the holding, the exchange rate fluctuation, and the projected growth in this to then determine whether this is something that people want to hold on to and whether the paying tax in the US on these is worth keeping those investments for them back in India. I mean, I know that we're kind of now getting into the specifics of this, but that is definitely a genuine concern for people who have these holdings in India and they then want to come to the US or are coming to the US, or sometimes they inherit
or are already here.
And they inherit these DEMATs, MAT accounts and insurance policies from their family.
I'm excited to announce that Expat Wealth has its first sponsor, the Global Financial Planning Institute. The GFPI exists to provide education, community, tools, resources, and ongoing research for financial planners and other advanced financial professionals working with international and cross-border clients in the US and Americans abroad. I'm a GFP Institute Fellow, and I've put all our employees through their GFPI programs when they join us. I've met some great people, I've learned a ton. It's a genuine community of internationally minded folk doing their best to serve their clients properly and, critically, sharing what they know in the oftentimes challenging and ambiguous US cross-border environment. And as anyone in this sector will tell you, you're always learning. So if you work with international clients and or Americans abroad, or if this is an area you're looking to get into, check out the GFPI at WW Institute. You will be glad you did, and I hope to see you there soon.
And you could have a situation where someone thinks they're coming for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever, right? And they hold on to these things. And imagine if I can imagine a scenario where someone's got various pensions that need, various retirement accounts that need declaring. They have a DEMAT account. It's got a handful of mutual funds in it. They have some of this insurance. It's got a handful of mutual funds in it. Each individual mutual fund or ETF needs this 8621. That adds up to a lot of reporting, which adds up to a substantial cost just for your tax preparer each year before you even get into any tax. But then that's great. Well, that's the wrong word to use, but that's fine, I guess, if they're going to go back and they can bear that cost in the short term. But I tell you what we see a lot is people come for 2, 3, 4 years and then they're just getting started and they decide to stay for 10. So when do you pull that ripcord? And 10 turns into forever in some cases. I can imagine that being a really, and then at that point, you've got a sunk cost. You've been doing all this reporting for 3, 4, 5 years. Then you think you might stay, and then you're going to have to surrender them and bear all that cost anyway. It puts people in a real bind.
Yeah, it does. Totally. I agree with you, because it's a conversation that you can't expect that you would have this problem, so to speak. I don't know, have any other word to say for that. But, maybe when it's hindsight is not possible here, or even foresight. You just have to take it as it comes. You are in India at this point of time. I'm a 25-year-old who's just got a job, and hey, I think like my parents tell me, hey, you know what, you should start SIP. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, that's the mutual funds are doing great. Our mutual funds are doing great. You just started working, go do that. And they start. And then, 4 or 5 years down the road, they're in the US. Okay, heads up, you have mutual funds, you need to do PFIC reporting. I think that's where our podcasts and things like that come in. Like, we are, hopefully people listen and they're like, wait a minute, I have mutual funds in India. Maybe there's some reporting I need to do.
Well, what's the ideal scenario? Is the ideal scenario that we catch people before they come? That's why I always think about this from a British perspective, is that I started it really to put this in. Our clients are people who are already here. Right? So most of the time, you are, first of all, clearing up a mess, right? An inadvertent mess. But what I hope is that over time, and this is starting to happen, is that more people catch us before they leave. They put it into Google or into AI, whatever it is. They find this episode or they find a different episode, and they become aware of these issues, and they reach out to us before they've left, or before they're a tax resident in the US. And that so much of the problems we talk about can be averted before they arrive here.
Absolutely.
Can be averted entirely, or we can put them into a position where the problem can't be averted, but it can be managed while they're here.
Exactly. Because there are ways that in India, let's say, for example, going back to this country, there is a way that you can classify certain things. You can never, there are other people that you have spoke to and they've already talked about this. It's really not, you can't go and put things in a trust, just because you're leaving that country, because that again triggers a whole lot of other situations which we don't want. And there's a time frame.
I believe each country should have a different name for trusts, because I think the general public thinks, oh, it's a trust. It's a trust there, it's a trust there, it's a trust there. It all works. That is not the case. I think each country should have its own name that another country cannot use, so that people don't fall into this trap of thinking it works everywhere.
Exactly. Definitely, going back to your point earlier, immigration planning, whether it is into the US or out, inbound, outbound, like we like to say, is a must. I think that it definitely is something that you should be thinking about, because money, I mean, you know what? We are all in this business of money. I mean, there's the other ethereal side of things, but when you come to this, you worked hard for it. This is something that you need to do. You cannot not pay taxes. You have to pay taxes. But at the same time, there is a smart way of doing things, which you are reporting this, but you're keeping the investments. And then at some point, like you said about pulling the cord, I think that as long as you've been compliant, the reporting aspect of it, if you are at some point in time, this doesn't make sense to you anymore, at least, the paper trail is there to show the government that this is where everything happened and this is the story.
Do you have anything like an ISA? So an ISA is a particular PFIC trap for Brits, where they have this ISA, they think it's tax-free it's like a Roth IRA, right? I know you know, but it's tax-free growth in the UK and tax-free withdrawals, and they moved to America, keeping them intact because no one's sure how long they'll be here. They don't want to give up something they've been saving for 10, 15, 20 years into it. It's super valuable. Not realizing that once they get into America doesn't recognize the ISA. America looks right through the ISA wrapper, sees you're holding a portfolio of PFICs, and this tax-free account turns into, not only is it taxable, but it's also punitively taxed, and very often, there's certainly additional reporting requirements, and also very often, because you've not been doing those reporting requirements, you're falling into non-compliance. So the ISA is a particular trap for Brits. Is there anything like that? It sounds like the life insurance policy you mentioned might be that.
Yes, exactly. The life insurance policies, especially if they are these so-called ULIPs, which are the unit-linked insurance policies. That's what they stand for. And that's a common one because they called all sorts of things and people use them for all sorts of, they use them for children's education funds, for their own retirement, for sometimes to just park extra money in because you know what, that's their plan 5 years down the road. I'm going to buy a flat in Mumbai, let's say, or whatever. That's what they use the ULIPs for, which in that context is a great idea. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, it couldn't be better than that. Like, you put 100K rupees in it for 5 years, and then 5 years later you have $1 million. I mean, I don't even know how that works, but it does apparently. But that's a common one that gets people all riled up when you have to tell them that now there is a PFIC reporting. Yeah. And like you said earlier, it's not easy to unravel. Yeah. Actually, I have a story about the Public Provident Fund, which kind of is, again, like we were talking about, the gray area, which it's very, very common. You have grandparents in India putting money into a PPF for their grandkids who are US citizens and who live here. Now, that's a big no-no. But people in India don't know that. For them, it's an act of love, is to go open a PPF and put money into it for their grandchild. But if you're not if you're not an Indian tax resident, you cannot put money into a PPF. And if you're not an Indian tax resident, you cannot hold a PPF. So after a certain period of time, if you have now stopped being an Indian resident and your plan is not to go back, then those PPFs are the first ones that need to get converted or liquidated. And if you have not reached a certain age, just like here in the US, if you take money out of an IRA before you're 59 and a half, there are all of these penalties. Then there are other penalties associated with that. So that's a common one as well. I see that quite a lot. People come and then they're like, oh, I have a PPF, and then we have to talk about, can you keep holding on to that? Possibly you cannot. You need to close that out. Yes.
What about real estate?
Oh, that's a good one. My Indian clients love their real estate. I love real estate. Yes. So many, many aspects to it. Of course, real estate by itself is not something that is a reportable asset. But of course, if this is a rental property, then it is. So again, that happens when either you have built or you bought a flat or you built a property, lived in it for a while, and then you come to the US. Now, of course, the Section 121 exclusion, which let me explain, is the exclusion that you get if a property was your primary residence and you sold it, and depending on your married filing status or your single status, you get a certain amount of money which is not taxable. And so the proceeds from the sale of these properties need to be within the threshold to be non-taxable, right? So that's an issue. Now, if the person has a flat which they have purchased and then that was their primary residence, now they are in the US, they may be renting it, then that rental property is reportable on their US return. If they are not renting it, then it's not a problem at all, but it's growing in value and appreciating. That's a great reason to maybe hold on to it. Then, of course, there's the inheritances. And some of these properties, depending on which city that they are in, can be very, very valuable. And so if they cross the $100,000, then, of course, there's the one-time reporting for inheritances from non-US persons, and that you report that, and then it depends on what you're going to do with that inheritance. Are you going to leave it? You're going to sell it? It's capital gains. You get the step up in basis, or you're going to keep renting it. Then the rental income is reportable on your US taxes. The depreciation treatment is different.
So it's just to be clear for people. So if this is if you're in the US or you're a US person and you're going to inherit property or assets from India, a relative has passed away in India and has left you money, assets, property, real estate, whatever, there may be tax to pay in India, but there shouldn't be, there's not going to be tax on you inheriting this. But if you're inheriting or being gifted, that's cash, property worth more than $100,000, this needs to be reported to the IRS on Form 3520. This is something that people miss all the time, right? And they don't really. People are scared that it means they're going to get taxed. No, you're going to potentially incur penalties just for not reporting it. But just reporting it doesn't mean you're going to incur taxation. You're not going to incur taxation. So this is another. The PFIC, I'd say PFICs are the scourge of cross-border advisors. But this receiving gifts, receiving inheritances, this is another common trap we all see.
Definitely, and there's no way of kind of getting around that. The only good thing is, of course, there is the step up in basis. If any of your inherited property gets sold, you can take advantage of that if it were to be taxable. Now, there's also the gifts. In India, the gifts from and there's a whole explanation to it, but there are the blood relatives, there's the first circle, second circle, etc. And there are certain relatives that you can receive or give gifts to that are non-taxable. So if my father gave me a gift, that would not be a taxable gift. But if my father were a resident of India, and if this was more than $100,000, then yes, it needs to be reported to the IRS just because I received it in that year and it was more than that threshold. And that goes even with a lot of my Indian clients get, jewelry and other collectibles as inheritances and gifts. So those all, you don't want to talk about the gold and silver prices today, but
there's a lot more people being caught by this, is what you're saying, right? With gold prices and where they are.
Yeah. So if you're going to go get that jewelry valued, and if it's going to cross $100,000, it wouldn't have been reportable on your Indian tax return or Indian gift, but it would be on your US tax return.
It's a mindset shift as much as anything. People got to think just because it's okay in one jurisdiction doesn't mean okay is the wrong word. Just because there's no requirements or issues on this side,
absolutely,
it's not on this side. And even you've always got to double check on both sides to being compliant in America. Yeah. And it catches everyone out because it's kind of unique in the way it does this.
Absolutely.
This has been fantastic. Thank you. Where can people find you?
I am on LinkedIn. People can find me on LinkedIn. People can go to my website, mntaxbiz.com. That's pretty straightforward. I do dabble in other social media, but not as much as I am on LinkedIn and easily reachable. So those are some of the places.
As I mentioned at the beginning, you have a podcast as well on this?
With Jane Meefam, one of my favorites.
We know Jane, a friend of Plan First Wealth. Thank you for leading me on this journey out of my own comfort zone. This is my first time really exploring a group other than Brits, and as expected, massive similarities. The names of the products are different, but the problems are identical in many ways. And hopefully, I hope there's someone in India who's yet to move to America who picks this up and avoids a lot of heartache, a lot of emotional strife, and hopefully a lot of potential savings as well as a result of finding this podcast. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me. This was absolute fun.
Of course.
Yes.
Come back.
Of course. Please have me back again.
I will. Thank you.
Yes.
See you soon.
Yeah, bye.
All right, folks. That's another episode of Expat Wealth under our belts. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it and I appreciate you. If you're enjoying the show and would like to support the mission, which is to help ambitious expats thrive in America, I'd ask you to subscribe to the pod wherever you listen. And also consider leaving a rating and review. This stuff really does matter. Please help us get this information to the people who need it. That is, to your fellow expats. Just a quick reminder that this show is brought to you by Plan First Wealth. We are a US-based financial planner and wealth manager, and we help successful American and international families living across the US to make the most of their opportunity and ultimately to retire happier. If you'd like to know more about how we might be able to help you, you can find us on our website, www.planfirstwealth.com, or you can look me up on LinkedIn. Do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. As always, thank you to the podcast guys for their help producing this episode and the entire show. See you next week.